Stella, and I'm here with another book review and a bit of a book discussion this time because I'm going to be talking about The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I'm going to be doing a lot of comparison between this book and the movie, the new release of this movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, because this is probably one of the first books I've ever read where I watched the movie first and then I read the book. I very rarely ever do that. So this was one of those movies, this was one of those situations, and in this situation in particular, the movie really stood out for me and it was really fresh in my mind. So then when I went in and read this, I was constantly doing this comparison. So I thought I would talk about it. So The Great Gatsby, for those who don't know, is a story about the narrator for this whole story is Nick. And he is moving to New York, and he is going to get into the stock markets and try to make a life for himself. And he ends up meeting up with his cousin, Daisy, and meeting the Great Gatsby, who he ends up renting a home right next door to. Gatsby's character, of course, is deeply in love with Daisy's character, and all the motivations that he's had since meeting Daisy first when they were both quite young, but he was a soldier before going off to the war, and after the war was over, Gatsby returns, and Daisy is already married and has a child, and Gatsby just desperately wants to return to the point in his past where Daisy loved him and he was in love with Daisy, and where he felt there was this peak in his life where he was the happiest. And so all of his motivation up to this point is to get back to Daisy and to have her love him again and to continue that relationship, and continue that relationship from the moment where it left off all those years ago. So this is a beautifully written novel. This is my first Fitzgerald novel that I've ever read, and I cannot express enough how beautiful the writing is. This is a very short story. It's like, I don't know, this rendition of this copy of this book is about 144 pages long. And the amount of emotion and complexity of character and story that is built into a chapter of this, into a novel and a story of this length is mind-boggling. Like, it's amazing. It is a feat in itself. I rated this a 5 out of 5 on Goodreads. It is definitely a book that I will pick up again and reread because there are so many passages and quotes that stayed with me after I read it, and I go back to. And I was actually reading this with a writer friend of mine, and we were sending emails back and forth to each other about favorite quotes and discussing the characters, and I found it a really fun way to read a novel, because that's really the first time I've ever done that, where I was basically chapter by chapter talking to someone else about it, and I really, really enjoyed this novel. I really recommend it. So I said I was going to do some comparisons to the movie as to the novel and what some of the differences I felt, which kind of changed or tweaked the story for better or for worse. So here we go. Number one, I found Nick's character in the book was so much better than it was in the movie. And I don't know if that has to do with just how the lines were delivered or Tobey Maguire's performance. I don't know what it was. But in the book, Nick is such a lovable character. He's so level-headed and he's so unjudgmental of everything that's happening around him. And he comes from a family that's perhaps not as well off as Daisy is now, but a well-to-do family, and never at any point does that a sort of snobbery or pretentiousness come off of him. And that, for me, was so refreshing because never has the plight of the bored, rich, and wealthy appealed to me. So I loved Nick in the book. In the movie, Nick just comes across as this sort of like pushover, awkward, sort of gangly weirdo, Weirdo is maybe a strong word. But he just comes across as so awkward and just spineless. And so, and he really, I didn't feel that in the book. And not to say that in the book, like I'm calling him spineless in the movie, but it's not like in the book he takes charge and tells people what he thinks or anything. It's just, he just seems like a more introverted, analytical sort of character, which I love. So first of all, that was one of the things that I felt was quite different. Another thing that I thought was quite different was the character of Myrtle in the movie as compared to the book. In the book, Myrtle is like an older, thicker build, sub-average woman. Like she's just, it sounds like she's very plain. She sounds like she has a good, a vibrant personality necessarily, but she's just sort of meh is what I get from the book. Whereas in the movie, she's young and beautiful and vibrant and thin, and it's just, it paints such a different motive in my mind for the reason that Tom would cheat on his wife. It just, for me, it sort of changed the motivation for it. And I know that in movies, everybody wants what's pretty to look at. And so perhaps the more realistic characters weren't going to happen in a movie, especially The Great Gatsby, since it's so atmospheric, if that makes any sense. But I just felt that that really changed it. Tom's character is very similar from the movie to the book. He's this sort of almost a caricature in his deplorable villain role. He's racist and abusive and a snobby adulterer without any compassion. And so he's basically the same from the movie to the book. And then we have Daisy's character. And I found in the movie, I really disliked Daisy's character because she just comes across as this vapid woman who just wants attention and is vain and just wants people to love her, and she flirts with everybody. And which isn't to say that that's completely different from who she was in the book, but in the book, she didn't come across as over the top as she did in the book. And again, perhaps that had to do with how lines were delivered. I did feel that there was a bit of a difference between Daisy's character from the book to the novel, to the movie, from the novel to the movie. And so I did appreciate Daisy a little more when I read the novel. So that was a good thing. Definitely loved about Fitzgerald's writing was how he chose to end certain chapters, and it really, a lot of the chapters end with this compulsion to continue and read on in the story. He leaves a lot of the chapters in a sort of cliffhanger-like state, which is great because it makes it so compelling of a read. Something else that I found didn't translate as well in the movie, and sometimes was difficult to understand in the novel as well, was the passage of time. I found the passage of time really tricky to understand because in the movie, we don't really get a good grasp of the passage of time. It really seems that from the time that Gatsby meets Nick and then Nick agrees to reintroduce him to Daisy to the end of the novel, it feels like that basically composed maybe a month or something. Like it really felt like it moved very fast. Whereas I believe in the novel, it goes a lot slower. And I say I believe in the novel because oftentimes Fitzgerald moved from present tense to past tense. And oftentimes the perspective of Nick is, I would say sometimes compromised because he's telling this story, in going over the story, he's telling this story having already lived through the story. So we know that the story already happened in the past and he's sort of reliving it in his mind or whatever the case may be. But there are times in the story, as I said, that he jumps from present tense to past tense, and then also where he jumps to parts of the story where he didn't actually experience what was happening. It was those parts of the story were gained from third party. So it was gleaned from perhaps police reports or also other characters. So sometimes it got kind of confusing as to where in the storyline we were and how much time actually passed. Because I believe that a lot more time passes in the novel than just the month that I said that I get an inkling of in the movie. So that was very interesting. And another thing that I found interesting was Nick's interpretation of Gatsby. And there's that moment where they're driving around. Gatsby picks up Nick, and they're going to go off to lunch. And Gatsby's going to ask him for a favor, which is for Nick to introduce him to Daisy again. And he pulls out, like, so Gatsby has this idea that he has to prove to Nick who he is. And so he pulls out his medal and a picture from Oxford and all that kind of thing. And I felt that just in the novel, it was so much funnier of a scene than it was in the movie. Even though I think Leonardo DiCaprio did a good job of his role as Gatsby, it was so much more funny to read and imagine it in my mind and have Nick's narrative of the events than to actually watch it. So that was interesting, I think. I would definitely say that I think I preferred the book to the movie, but there were a few instances where I think the movie actually did a better job of certain scenes than even the book did. And there was only a couple instances of this. So one of the first instances was in chapter 5, where there's a moment outside Gatsby's home where Nick returns from dinner with Jordan, and he says that he will set up the meeting with Daisy. And then Gatsby offers Nick this side job that could make him some money. In the book, Nick simply just declines this, and that's the end of the scene. Whereas in the movie, Gatsby keeps insisting that he should take it. And in the movie, Nick says that Gatsby doesn't need to pay him back for setting up the meeting with Daisy. That he's glad to help and he doesn't expect anything in return. And I felt this was a really great moment in the movie for Gatsby and Nick's character, because I think this is the first time that Gatsby encounters someone in his life who is willing to do something for him and doesn't expect anything in return, that doesn't see his money as a way to gain something for themselves. And so I really felt that that was a great moment in their friendship, and where it became sort of a genuine thing and not just this thing that Gatsby was trying to encourage so that he can meet Daisy. I felt that was the moment in the movie, at least, that their friendship became genuine. And you didn't really see that in the book. So I thought that was extremely well done. Another moment in the same, really close to that moment, was where I felt that the moment was done better in the movie, was when Daisy cries into all of Gatsby's shirts after he's tossing them out of his closet. And in the book, only a few short sentences are spent on this moment, and then it's gone. So Daisy basically just cries into his shirts and says that the shirts are so beautiful, and she'd never seen such beautiful shirts, and she's crying about it, and then the scene just ends. And so I found myself really thinking, if that was all I had read of it or known of it, I really would have thought that Daisy was even more vapid than I originally had thought, because, I mean, who cries over shirts just being beautiful? Whereas what I found in the movie was that moment was drawn out more, and Gatsby comes to Daisy when she's crying, and they sort of have this moment where they pause and look at each other. And I definitely get the feeling that Daisy's crying because she's thinking about how her life would have been different with Gatsby, and the regret makes her cry. And she covers it with the thought that, oh, these shirts are so beautiful, and it's making her cry. And of course, I'm sure that's what the book was alluding to as well, but just with how quickly that really, I feel, an important moment was glossed over, you just didn't get that feeling from it. And so I thought that was really well done in the movie as opposed to the novel. Another something that I found interesting in the book was Gatsby is painted as this very mysterious character, and we never really understand necessarily all of what's going on in Gatsby's world and how exactly he became as rich and where his money comes from and where he's been and where he's spent all his time. So there's this very big mystery around Gatsby. And what I found sort of interesting in the telling of this story is that Nick basically lets the cat out of the bag, spills the beans about Gatsby before Gatsby actually tells him what happens in the story. So we basically have Nick obviously telling the story of the Great Gatsby after he's already lived through it and before he actually learns of the truth about Gatsby in the actual sequence of events in the story. He tells us what of Gatsby's past. And this is a very strange thing because this whole mystery of Gatsby was a very compelling portion of the story. And for Nick's character to just sort of, you know, admit to Gatsby was a fraud before Gatsby actually is revealed as a fraud, sort of kills some of the tension that could possibly be there and the surprise of learning this. But I really wonder, and I think possibly that the reason that was done, or the reason that Nick does that, is to make Gatsby make the reader more compassionate to Gatsby, because there's something to be said about someone being caught in a lie, whereas if you knew about the lie before that person is caught in the lie, you're definitely more compassionate to that person. So I think that possibly that's the reason that it was done in that way. But it is very interesting to sort of examine that. And then there was chapter 7, where there is the car accident with Myrtle and Myrtle dies. When in the novel, obviously Nick doesn't witness this. He doesn't witness the car accident because he is behind Gatsby and Daisy in a separate vehicle. But in the novel, I think basically he tells a story of what happened and what led to the events leading up to and how Myrtle dies based on a police report or something like that. But I found that really sort of confusing because we go through this scenario where Nick sort of tells us the facts of what's happened, and then he picks up the story from where he arrives at the scene after Myrtle has been struck by a vehicle and police have already showed up, and then we get almost all the same information that he just told us from the police report once he gets there. So there's this sort of, I'm wondering what was the reasoning behind telling us what happened and then getting there, finding out what happened. And it's a little bit redundant in a sense. I felt that was a little odd. And then of course that translates better in a movie because even though we have the narrator, we still get to see what's happening because the story's happening real time, right? So possibly that worked out a little better also in the movie as opposed to the novel. And then on to chapter 8, something that I found very strange in this chapter was it felt like a bit of a POV violation because Nick recaps the events of what happened after he and Jordan and Tom had left the scene where Myrtle had died. And how does he know what happened after they left? You know, before we get that he got it maybe from a police report or overhearing the police talking to witnesses and that. But after he leaves, how does he know what happens? Like we can assume that it was all gleaned from Michaelis? I'm saying that completely wrong. But the Greek neighbor to Myrtle's husband. So we can understand that possibly it's coming from him, all this information, but I mean, it's not really said that that's where we got this. I mean, you can assume it because he's the only other person in the scene. It seems a bit of a POV violation to me. That would be another thing that I think worked out a little bit better in the movie than necessarily in the novel. And then, since this book is only 9 chapters long, at the end, I just felt it was, you know, such a sad story, and was so interesting was this whole idea of the pool in Gatsby's mansion, how he lived there for, I'm assuming, a few years, and he's had all these extravagant parties, and he's never been in that pool, and he says this a couple times, and then his death is where he actually uses the pool. And it's so sad, and I think illuminates how, I guess, his life was just like a show because he wanted to win Daisy. And I found myself really wondering and hoping, I guess, that I hope that Daisy loved him and that Gatsby loved her and that the love was genuine, but oftentimes just felt that in a lot of ways it wasn't this genuine love, that it was just this sort of fantasy worked up in both of their minds because, you know, Daisy's trapped in this marriage with this man who doesn't appreciate her in the way that she feels she should be appreciated. He's a bigot and he's a terrible person, and he's having this affair on her, and she knows well and good about it, and he's been known to have plenty of affairs. And so I wonder if Gatsby was just a convenient escape, and, you know, all of his money obviously made him attractive to Daisy. And I'm sure that Daisy did love him, and I'm sure that Gatsby loved her as well. But there were those moments where it hinted at how the illusion or the fantasy was different than the reality, and possibly how there was some disappointment at that. But I mean, they still both, I believe, loved each other. But it was so sad how, you know, Gatsby was so willing to cover up, was willing to do anything for Daisy, and it felt like Daisy just wasn't willing to do the same. She wasn't willing to go as far for Gatsby. And so, you know, it was so sad and poignant at the end where, I mean, she doesn't go to his funeral. She takes off, and she doesn't even care. And it was so sad and sweet at the same time because we were hearing this story through Nick, and there's this melancholy for it, and we have this sort of hope for Nick that he's going to leave from this, and we definitely understand that his and Jordan's relationship was a much more realistic relationship, even though it wasn't as passionate and fantastic as Gatsby and Daisy's, but it was definitely more real and tangible than theirs was. And even though it didn't work out between Jordan and Nick, you really have this sense of hope that Nick goes on and he's learned so much just from his experiences in New York and how all that glitters is not gold. And I just felt it was a really beautiful and touching story. And I've had lots of people tell me about how this was such a sweet story, and I didn't really feel that it was a sweet story. It was very sad but so touching, and I would really recommend it to anybody. So enough with my meandering thoughts here. Again, The Great Gatsby by Scott Fitzgerald, an amazing book. I really recommend it, and you just need to read this. All right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!